Hello and welcome back to this Downful Idealistic Crusade. In this video, I'm going to be doing a review and overall analysis of The Body Snatchers, or as it's better known, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Jack Finney's original novel, which first appeared as a Collier's serialized story, I think split into three parts, in late 1954, where producer Walter Wanger, who was looking for a property while he was basically trying to rebuild his career, decided he was going to adapt this as his next film, along with Don Siegel after their successful ride in Cell Block 11. So the film, of course, became, well, pretty much immediately iconic, and even more so over time, but of course has been remade innumerable times because the core of the story has transcended into pop culture. So the terms pod person and the idea of losing one's humanity has become pretty much commonplace. It's an idea that everybody has at least some grasp of, and that's why we've seen so many remakes of the story as films in different eras to reflect the specific concerns of said era. It's an idea that is timeless. The whole concept of an outside force taking over bodies, essentially. But interestingly, when you go and read Finney's original novel, it's similar in ways to reading Who Goes There, which was the story that was used to adapt into The Thing from Another World, and then, of course, its remake in 1982, the John Carpenter remake of The Thing. So when you read the actual source material, it's very similar in aspects, but you can see what certain adaptations have pulled from, which ones stray much more closely to the original material, but then also some complete surprises and elements that are completely different, or elements that have never been utilized in an adaptation. So it's always an interesting, fresh take on a story to actually get to the original source material for the first time. But I don't think many people have actually read The Body Snatchers or Invasion of the Body Snatchers, whichever title you want to use. I think I'll just stick with Invasion of the Body Snatchers so it's at least consistent. You don't really see much discussion about Finney's original novel, which is actually, I think, a shame because it's a well-written, engaging book that, while I do think the 1956 film version does make some important dramatic changes to really heighten the intensity of the overall paranoia and the tension and just the entire drama of the story is much more focused, but also the film has a much shorter runtime and was done on a more limited production schedule for Allied artists, so it had to have that regardless. But the book does have a number of interesting elements. It is quite similar to what you see in the 1956 film, so if you're familiar with that film, or even the Philip Kaufman 1978 remake, the book will seem pretty familiar. It is very similar to the 1956 version. I will avoid spoilers in this review, except for there is some material I would like to discuss in particular, so I will preface that with when I get into light spoiler territory, or I talk about the book's ending, which is notably different to all the film adaptations. That is definitely the moment where, if you're familiar with the story from the films, it's the ending in particular of the book where you basically take a left turn and you are in completely uncharted territory. So that will definitely feel like an about face if you're only used to the film versions. The book's plot revolves around Dr. Miles Bennell, who works in a small California town as the local doctor. And this is, exactly the same setup we have in the 1956 film, so this should all be relatively familiar to people who know the film. He has a small town practice, but is himself a bit of an outsider. He's a recently divorced man who also has a habit of cracking jokes to sort of diffuse tension, and in some ways sort of basks in being an outsider and a sort of loner in ways. And this is very important to the overall core themes of the story, and you see this, I think, in at least the 1956 film adaptation to a certain degree in terms of the characterization, so that checks. But he starts getting people coming in, or people telling him this same peculiar complaint that their relative or loved one or someone that they know no longer quite seems like themselves, even though for all intents and purposes it is exactly the same person. But it starts as one case, then becomes another, and this is even confirmed confirmed by his running into an old flame, Becky Driscoll, who is also a recent divorcee, and they had a past relationship when they were in school together many years before, and that's sort of rekindled in a way. But she comes to Miles about her cousin who believes her Uncle Ira is no longer her Uncle Ira. And this gives Miles a particular case to examine while also starting to develop the romance of the story. This peculiar unease and sense of oddness, this malaise that seems to be creeping through and making its way through the populace of this small California town is furthered when Miles and Becky are called away to a friend of his house who has discovered a corpse, but a very strange corpse, just happening to reside in his basement. This is a corpse that is a perfectly formed body that doesn't have any markings on it whatsoever. It's compared to a coin that has not been fully stamped, like the molds and impressions are not finished, and said corpse doesn't even have a set of fingerprints. This is such a peculiar occurrence that then we have essentially two couples of, again, outsider characters who are not your typical people in the town and have a sort of status that keeps them slightly removed from the sort of general day-to-day activities of everyone else who doesn't have peculiar hang-ups or isn't holed up in their house as a mystery writer trying to crank out their next story. It becomes an investigation of sorts that, as most everybody who knows the concept of pod people or body snatchers as a story, and one of the film adaptations is, of course, an alien race that has infiltrated Earth in the form of seed pods that is taking the forms of the people in the town for various purposes, and then the originals are essentially destroyed. It is unclear at first why this is going on, or if they're merely imagining things. So we do get the nice play with trying to determine what is real and what is perhaps a delusion, even going in to check with a psychologist friend of Miles, who is eventually having to be questioned. Are they part of the conspiracy or not? And the interesting thing about Body Snatchers as a story, and in the 1956 adaptation as well, it's not really even that it's a conspiracy. It's that it's more the idea and concept of a slow-burning menace, because the alien seed pods are merely carrying out their natural function. The horror of the story is more a sense of unease and what can happen, and your own being subsumed and stripped of any and all emotion. But then that also highlights an interesting psychological conceit of the story, that in certain ways the pod people who have no emotions also don't have the pesky little problems of humanity. So there is a certain salesman's pitch for people becoming pods to not have certain problems of humanity, but also it's a very boring existence. And this is another element that we get hints of and then is fully explained in Finney's novel that you don't really have in any of the film adaptations. And it's the idea that the pod people are lazy and that they have no real motivation for doing anything other than surviving. And so this leads to a number of extremely chilling moments throughout the book where it ties into the sense of unease. And the theme that Finney is, I think, really trying to hone in on is the idea of the death of the small town America in terms of the social atmosphere of how American society was revolving around the small town and the central town square, and how at this time the idea of the small town was already starting to completely die off as people moved more and more to larger cities, and you lost a particular culture, really. And so I think that's a theme that Finney is playing with in this novel, and it's very much apparent throughout. I think you get it somewhat in the 1956 version, but of course it's not in the other versions, which are primarily set in urban areas, or if you're looking at the 1993 film version on an army base. So it's a unique setting that I think really befits the story well, and I think the story loses something when it doesn't have that small town setting, which also helps to tighten the narrative and focus the drama on our particular characters. Again, the book is, I think, very well written. It's a very quick and enjoyable read with a number of, again, very chilling moments that are specifically unique to the book, and almost all of them, it's not a horror story about gore moments or gross out moments or having jump scares and things like that. It's more about the deliberate sense of unease that one can feel, and then how one basically unravels the threads to figure out the actual threat, and then feeling the full weight and impact of that upon you. And then in particular moments where the book gets really chilling is where you have essentially the people that our characters have known and loved and been around their entire lives, having that mask suddenly slip a little bit, and then in certain instances dropping entirely, or hearing the conversations of the pod people without the pods knowing that they're being eavesdropped on, and so they're just talking naturally with zero emotion, and how just a single sentence can have a completely different effect just due to the tone, or shall we say lack of tone, lack of inflection, lack of humanity. It's a fascinating, different sort of view of the story that we know from the film adaptations. And there's also a greater sense of a certain grounding in humor, and this is a particular element that Don Siegel really strove to get in the 1956 film that was edited out by Allied artists. You do have flashes of it, but we've only been able to read about the original version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the film. But the key thing that Allied artists hacked out when they made the shortened theatrical version was all the humor in the film. There's a little bit left here and there, but we don't have Dr. Miles being the wisecracking machine that he is in the book, and a lot of that is a self-defense mechanism, and it fits with the character and the characterization, and even some of the other characters joke around a little bit, but there's also a greater sense of character nuance, because with the greater page count, there's more time for the scenes to develop. Again, this is a book that's a slow burner of a story, but that leads to one of my criticisms of the book, and something that I think the adaptation for the 1956 film by the great Daniel Mainwaring, one of the great screenwriters of his era, responsible for the masterpiece Out of the Past, and also its source novel Build My Gallows High. What Mainwaring does in his screenplay is to make sure that the drama and the tension is focused to where the opening it's planting the seeds, shall we say, to use a very bad pun, of the sense of malaise in the small town, and that something's not quite right, and there's an eerie quality right there from the opening sequences, and this only starts to build. And yes, it's dissipated a little bit by humor and characters telling themselves that, oh, they're just crazy, or there's nothing really going on, or they're being silly. Essentially, once the curtain is pulled back or the penny is dropped and the menace of the alien pods is fully revealed to our main characters, the tension never lets up, and it just builds and builds and builds and builds in a pressure cooker until we finally have the iconic running through the town and running through their lives and hiding and trying to stay awake, and Don Siegel just hammers home on this. It's why the film remains the best adaptation and the best of all the film versions, and one of the greatest science fiction films ever made, because at its heart it's a psychological thriller more than it is a science fiction film, and the last thing it really is a horror film, because like Finney's novel, the horror is all of the slow burning intellectual but also deep gut emotional variety. But in Finney's novel, there are multiple points, and I think any reader used to the films will kind of feel this, but anybody reading this book for the first time will be kind of confused as to why at several points in the book the tension gets dissipated. Like the characters start to catch on to things, and they seem to have enough events to happen that indicate, okay, well, there's certainly something going on here, and then they get sort of convinced out of it, or they convince themselves out of it. And this happens, I'd say, at least 2 or 3 times. And then that means the tension and drama has to build all over again, and has to build it to that same point. It's like letting the air out of the balloon, and then it just flattens again and has to build again. And the worst example of this, and something that I couldn't believe when I read this book, that this actually occurred, is that all four of our lead characters who are on in this sense of mortal peril, and this is the make or break point, they then decide they've got to get out of town. And they actually leave town. They actually get out of the city, and they stop at a motel. And instead of, going for help, going hell for leather to Los Angeles or a big city or something, or that, they make the unbelievable decision that, okay, yeah, we've been at this point multiple times now. Let's just turn around and go back home. So they actually turn around to drive back into the city, which I think is the big no-no of this story, because it basically pulls the dramatic rug out from under you. But it also shows how the book is an even slower burner than you might expect. The writing style and the fact that it was written in the 1950s, originally for Collier's Magazine, it definitely has a pulpy flavor to it. You can definitely get the sense this was a book written in the 50s. And it also has a charge from the first-person narration by Dr. Bonnell of, well, obviously he's not a private eye. You can kind of get a little bit of the flavor of first-person private eye narration in a 1950s pulp detective novel. It's got a little bit of that flavor, and that's the energy and the charge that keeps the reader entertained. But that was the real moment for me where when I was reading the book that I knew there were some things that the film did improve upon in 1956. Certain things that do raise a couple red flags. The biggest criticisms the book usually gets is that when the characters actually have the story of the seed pods sort of explained to them, which we basically get a version of in all the film adaptations, is that the book actually tries to explain everything and is a bit long-winded in doing so. It certainly is. I can understand those criticisms. Some of the story of the seed pods and how they regenerate and what they're actually doing and how they copy people and how they even got to Earth, some of that was basically lifted for the 1978 remake. So basically the seed pods drifting through space and the sort of descriptions of how they reform and copy things in their plant-like state and everything, and the stuff we see in the 1978 film is basically taken from this rather long-winded explanation, and also the 78 film really pushes the gore and horror elements. It's trying to make the story much more of an out-and-out horror film, which is why it usually is the film that gets the most focus and attention nowadays in 2024. The book really doesn't need all of that explanation, and the 1956 film very much takes the less is more approach and is all the better for it. I do like the explanation, and it makes sense within the book's internal logic. Scientifically speaking, it may not obviously be 100% accurate, but it at least makes enough sense in the book's logic. But also the explanation does tie into some of the book's themes that are unique about the death of the small town, the death or changing of culture, and I think underlines how the story's real theme, in spite of all the discussion that's gone on about the film in 1956 being a parable about the HUAC witch hunts, or the idea of communist infiltration, or that it was political at all. The real theme of the story and the core, basically, of every adaptation, despite where they may go with it, is that it is a story about not just the death, but the assimilation of individualism and essentially people going through life asleep, as if they were indeed a pod person, which is why sleep is the the time at which the change takes place, and when the pods start taking over the forms and consciousness of the person they are copying. Ultimately, I think Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the novel, is a really fun and interesting read. I think we get more nuances for the lead characters, and especially more detail about the small town itself, and Finney's concerns about the death of small town life and culture, but also his theme and talking about how the pod people essentially don't do anything other than try to survive. The book very clearly indicates that once the pods start taking over, the town more and more, for lack of a better term, starts to go to seed. Even the roads deteriorate. And so the idea is that after a certain point, the pods use up a certain area, and then eventually the entire planet they've landed on, and exhaust all the natural resources, and then move on to another planet. And they've been doing this for ostensibly an indefinite amount of time, and it will just continue on and on and on. And they've destroyed endless numbers of worlds. Earth is just now their next pit stop, if you will. And this is further explained in that main expository scene, which hits the nail on the head by making the direct connection. Well, is that any different from what the human race has done to the Earth itself? And there's not really an argument for that. So there's a lot of interesting intellectual themes throughout the book. There's a lot to chew over, essentially, and we have a bit more insight into our lead character of Miles Bennell, because the book is told from the first person, and we have much more of his reflection, but also more of his cracking wise. The relationship with Becky Driscoll is also a little bit different in that, I think, due to the way that Miles essentially puts on a sort of public persona in a certain way, that you have a little bit more of an outdated male-female relationship dynamic. There's not the basically feeling of an immediately resumed romance that should have never have been ended like we get in the 1956 film. And also, you don't quite get the tragic romance aspect that we get in both the 1956 and 78 films. So it's interesting to see how that romance is here in the book, but it's mostly the same characters, but the rendering's a little different, and the romance is more of a slow build, because Miles, at first, because they're both divorcees, thinks that he can just have fun with Becky because she'll understand him, because they're both essentially in the same boat, and in a certain way they're sort of outsiders. And I think the idea that all our four lead characters who are investigating these strange goings on are themselves in certain ways outsiders compared to everybody else in the town. That's, I think, the reason why they are the ones who have not been assimilated and the ones who catch on, because they themselves are the ones who are least sleepwalking through life. And now we have to discuss the book's ending, and this is where I'll get into a bit of spoiler territory, because the ending in the book is completely unique. And it's also, I think, the weakest aspect of the book. It has some great ideas, and the overall impact of what the ending is actually saying, when you actually stop and think about it, is quite chilling in a way, and is very unique. And I really like that idea, but the ending is not really effective, and it feels like a complete left turn. It's very anticlimactic, and also it is very unsatisfying. So basically, spoilers begin here if you've not read the novel and you want to go in completely without any idea of how the book ends. But essentially, we have our characters of Miles and Becky on the run, as we see in the 1956 film. And when they encounter a farm that is actually farming the seed pods, as we see Kevin McCarthy's iconic Miles in the 1956 version observe to his absolute horror, instead of running away and having the downbeat ending of the 1956 version, the novel actually has Miles and Becky basically sneak into this farm and just burn all the seed pods that they can. They just start destroying them and setting them on fire and everything. And basically they're found and discovered, but instead of just getting rid of them, basically we have the rest of the seed pods just leave. They just go back to space because they've encountered resistance, and so they're like, oh, well, this is too hard, we're gone. And then basically everything's a-okay, and their friends were not assimilated and managed to go get help, and everything's fine. So, yeah, what I meant about the ending being very anticlimactic and unsatisfying, well, there you go. But then getting to the actual ending, because it's actually structured in that we have the sort of action set piece of Miles and Becky just having their last stand of setting all the seed pods on fire and destroying the farm, and it's like they're going to be caught and just forced to assimilate or just killed off or something. Then we have the seed pods just kind of go away, and then it kind of stops there, and then we have Miles essentially narrating the aftermath, and some time has now passed. So it is a little bit jarring because the book is built up to the climax as we see in the 1956 film, and then takes a left turn and then just kind of stops. And it's also a happy ending, and that doesn't really fit either with the tension that's been built. But where the book's ending really has impact and really completes the sort of slow burner type effect, and the horror being a feeling of dread. The ending image we're left with essentially is Miles talking about how the town is slowly coming back to life, but it's populated by all these pod people who have essentially been left here. And as we know, as is stated by the pods earlier, they only have about a 5-year lifespan. So essentially what happens is you have a town that is a small town filled with alien pod people with no emotions, who don't do anything, who have no humanity, and the town is falling apart. And there's, 4 or 5 people who are still human. But over the next 5 years, you have other people move into the town who aren't normal people, and one by one, these alien pod people just start dying off for seemingly no reason. And so essentially they've been given a living death sentence to just sit there until they die. And then slowly but surely the town becomes cleansed by the alien pod people dying off a handful at a time and being replaced by actual human beings who just happen to move into this small town or drive or pass through or something. It's a rather chilling and striking end concept. One can definitely visualize this. It has a real sense of that feeling of dread paying off. It's a very fascinating image to close the book on, but it's also done in passing, with Miles just telling us that this is going on, and he and Becky and everybody are just living in town, and things are slowly returning to normal, but everybody else has no idea what actually happened, and only they really know the ins and outs of the events that occurred. So it definitely, the whole ending of the book definitely ends with a whimper instead of a bang. It's definitely a letdown, I would say, but there's enough really interesting ideas, and that striking concept of the pod people being left to just essentially rot, and they literally just do nothing until they just die, because their one purpose is to essentially continue their race, and they cannot procreate. It's a fascinating idea. The way it is in the book, coming after suddenly having the action get curtailed and having this sort of everything's fine and turned out okay type of ending, it is unsatisfying in aspects. So I do think this is the key aspect, along with making the drama and tension focused from the very onset, and having the romance greater fused into the story, and also giving it that tragic element as well. That's what humanizes and adds to the drama of the 1956 adaptation even more. So I do think the 1956 film is an improvement on a lot of areas, but Finney's novel is an enjoyable read. It has a lot of extra texture and nuance that we haven't gotten in any of the other versions. It has some elements that were adapted into the 1978 film, which made that film unique. and it has certain elements of humor that were in the 1956 film but were edited out by Allied artists. So it's important to read the book to get more of that flavor. So I do think the book is very important. I think it's essential to read if you're a science fiction fan or if you've ever been fascinated by the concept of the story in one of the film adaptations. And if you're a great fan of any of the films like I am, it's an essential read. But I do think there are some moments for sure you can tell that, in particular, Daniel Mainwaring's screenplay adaptation for the 1956 film is a distinct improvement in terms of focusing on the unique story elements and really honing in on them, combined with Don Siegel's incredible direction. It gives the 1956 film a charge that is only present in spots in Finney's novel, if that makes sense. And one also has to keep in mind that this didn't start as a book. It was originally a 3-part serial in Collier's magazine, and then Finney turned it into a novel. I don't think there are many changes, but it would be interesting to compare the original serialized version to the novel version. Another thing to note is that whenever you get a copy of the book, it's almost always going to be the 1978 text. And that's what I have here in the tie-in 1978 paperback for the Philip Kaufman remake. Finney basically took his original novel from 1955, and as far as I or anyone can tell, he changed the year to be 1976 of the events taking place, and changed one or two other references to make it a 70s story, plus also inserted a nice sly in-joke that when Miles and Becky go to a movie, it just happens to be a movie adaptation of another Finney novel, so that's amusing, but otherwise, the book is still a 1950s book. It reads like a 1950s book, not in that it's specifically, full of dated elements, but you can very much tell it has the flavor of being a 1950s book. But from this point onward, and all reprints use the 1978 text, so don't be thrown off when you open it on page 1. It says, this happened in 1976, and it's like, no, it didn't. So that admittedly threw me for a while. I thought I had to find an original, rather expensive Dell 50s paperback, but actually it's just one or two names and dates that have been changed for the most part. Otherwise, it is exactly the same. This paperback, again, is for the tie-in for the 1978 remake. I was able to get this in really nice shape. So it's got the original gloss on here and the hype for the actual remake, but the text itself is in the traditional Dell paperback style with the nice green edges on the pages, but it is, again, very obviously when you're reading this, you can tell it's a 1950s work instead of a 1970s book. So don't worry if you've never read this and you see that the book was revised or changed. It was just changing the dates 2 or 3 times and 1 or 2 of the names, and that's pretty much it. For me personally, there was another particular element that stuck out, as I'm such a fan of the 1956 film, and that's the version I always think of, that seeing the characterizations of Miles and Becky and their relationship being handled a bit differently was rather interesting and surprising. Miles as a character, again, is a little bit more, for lack of a better term, a little bit more of a 1950s male, not terribly much, but there's a degree of that. There's a little degree of sexism inherent in terms of how he acts towards Becky, just a little tinge of that. And his demeanor's a little bit colder, but a bit more cynical than what we see in Kevin McCarthy's a bit more human and inherently more likable on the surface performance in the film, but also the Becky Driscoll character, because of her overall role. Some might label her in the film a damsel in distress to a degree, but she's just in the same peril as everybody else. But in the book, because we have more page count and more time for scenes to play out, a little bit more leisurely, her character feels a little bit more developed in certain areas because we simply didn't have time in the film and they were on the run so much. But also the film had a lot of the character and humor removed by the original studio, which was rather stupid because that really grounds the film and makes the horror elements much more real and believable because the story feels more lived in, because it feels more realistic and three-dimensional. But it's also reflecting the elements Finney has in his novel. So again, if you've always wondered what was the full tone of the original 1956 film before it was edited by the studio, what was it like? Well, just read Finney's novel and you definitely get more of that flavor that Don Siegel really regretted losing all the character and humor scenes. Well, it wasn't even his choice. He hated the fact that they cut it, and rightfully so. But if you've been like me and you've ever dreamed what was the original version of the film like, well, I think the book sort of scratches that itch to a degree. But I like that Becky's character in the book even specifically expounds upon a point that is in the film, but the book version of the character goes into it more. Essentially, when she says she's not a damsel in distress, she can help out more than the men think that she can, and it in some ways kind of reminded me of Bram Stoker's Mina in Dracula, and how she's such a wonderful character that is much more resilient than the men around her give her credit for, and then she proves it. So I really liked that was a point in the film that's actually a bit more gone into in the novel. So there's a number of nice surprises. And again, outside of discussing the ending in particular for those who have read the book or are curious and don't care about spoilers, that's the only thing I really wanted to get into in specific detail, because I think reading the book is a nice surprise for the first time, because there are all these lovely and really chilling moments that are unique to the novel but fit in with the concepts in the book that don't always get translated into the film adaptations or simply aren't there at all. I think the 1956 film is the best of the film adaptations, and I do think it is better overall than Finney's novel in terms of being a completely unified and even more striking drama in terms of how gripping it is from start to finish, and letting the sense of dread become horror to feeling the same emotional distress as our characters at the climax of the film. You have that in the book, but never to the same palpable degree as the film, because the film in its adaptation makes some very important structural changes and makes sure that we never let that tension get completely cut off, or having to start building it back up again as we do in the novel, at least on a few occasions. And there are a few moments in the book that are definitely a bit expository, probably not necessary. Again, the 1956 film understands the less is more concept, and I think is more effective in those areas. But there's something to be said for the book being able to have a more leisurely pace and letting the slow burn really continue on a low flame for even longer, while giving us more character detail and context about the world of the story, and in particular building to the impact of in the reader's mind of what exactly it is like in that town after the events of the climax. What we are told is happening at the very end, as I discussed in my spoiler section. That's when the book comes full circle, and all the themes and the background detail and the greater texture of the story, everything suddenly becomes fully formed, and the weight of all that sinks in, and then the reader finally grasps what the ending is actually saying, and is sort of just kind of putting out there as like an aside, and you're like, no, that's that's unbelievably chilling. So I think there's great stuff in the book. I think it's an enjoyable read. I think it's a classic of the genre with good reason, and there's of course reason why it's been adapted time and time again. It is a timeless story and a concept that people know at large in pop culture, even if they've obviously never read the book or seen any of the film adaptations. But I do think the 1956 film makes a number of important changes that really perfect the story, and a lot of the these were adapted by the 1978 Philip Kaufman remake, but that changes the locale to an urban setting and tries to make the story much more of a horror story that's an overt horror story. But that also takes interesting pieces of Finney's novel that hadn't been really used or mined in the 56 version. So it's important to look at all three, I think. And one can make the argument there's some bits that are used for the 1993 film as well, so that takes some interesting ideas. And again, this is a story that never dies. There will obviously be another remake of the story as a film or a streaming series or something. It's going to happen, and it's been referenced and alluded to, or just the overall concept has been built upon so much so that the idea itself could be perhaps seen as a cliche. Again, the same thing happened to The Thing. The concept that was behind Who Goes There becoming the thing from another world, and just the overall idea of the creature and the setup of the discovery of such an alien creature is so ingrained in pop culture that the ideas themselves, the story concepts, are pretty much cliches. And this, of course, goes all the way back to the explosion of science fiction in the pulp magazines in the 1930s and back even further. But especially all the classic stories of the 50s have formed the backbone of what we take for granted now within the genre. But Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a classic. It is a very good novel. It's just, I think, in certain ways, not as effective as the 1956 film, but has enough unique elements that also enrich your viewing experience of all the adaptations that I think it's a must read at least once. I think people should read this. And I enjoyed this book so much that I'm very interested in reading some of Finney's other works, and someday I'd like to maybe find some non-pricing editions of the Collier's magazine issues, or maybe somebody might reprint the original 3-part version just to see if there's any differences between it and the book version. But Finney's novel is a really excellent read. It has plenty of moments that will be chilling to the reader even today. Even if you think you know the story from the film adaptations, the book is still quite different in enough areas to make it its own unique thing. And it is very much a book that is a story with a slow burn, which allows the sense of danger and building dread to be very visceral. And that's what I've always enjoyed about the story. So it's fascinating to finally read the novel and compare it to the 1956 film that I love so much, and the other adaptations, and see how the story has essentially grown over time. But all the core ideas and everything are still in the seed pod of the original Jack Finney novel. So those are my thoughts on reading Jack Finney's novel Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and then also comparing and contrasting a little bit with the two primary film adaptations, but especially with the masterpiece 1956 first film adaptation, and especially Daniel Mainwaring's screenplay adaptation. Again, I think the book is fascinating. It's a very, very good read, and also a rather quick one. The trouble usually is in finding a copy, because it seems to kind of go in and out of print in terms of who's publishing it and if there's an edition in print. But get any version you can. They're all pretty much going to be the slightly tweaked 1978 text, which is fine, because that's pretty much all you can get your hands on. But I would highly recommend this to all science fiction fans. If you're a sci-fi fan and you've not read this yet, you definitely should. And if you're like me and have been a fan of one of the film adaptations and just not read the book before, and maybe thought it wasn't all that different, well, it actually is in a lot of ways, but they're more subtle ways, essentially. So don't sleep on not reading this, because it really is rewarding. And as I said, I think having an understanding of Finney's novel and the themes he's talking about specifically in the book that aren't necessarily front and center in the film versions, it will only enhance those elements and make them more apparent. And I think reading the novel actually enriches the films themselves, even though they make their own deviations and improvements and changes and tweaks. I think having the knowledge of the novel actually makes a lot of that texture start to come alive in the films themselves. So, as always, I hope my babblings about books and comparing books to film adaptations and, of course, classic works overall has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up a copy of Finney's novel in whichever form you find it in. And, of course, keep reading print books. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Just whatever you do, it's probably not the best idea to be reading Finney's novel in bed late at night when you're already sleepy, because then you'll start to fall asleep and you'll find yourself in that strange state between being awake and being asleep and not being quite firmly connected to reality. And then you start wondering, is there a seed pod in the basement?